Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about shading geometric forms with charcoal. You're going to want to have your supplies ready. You want to have your compressed charcoal, your kneaded eraser, your chamois cloth, your charcoal pencils, your reference image, either printed or on the computer screen, and I like to have some either wet wipes or a damp cloth I can use to wipe my fingers when necessary. Make sure you're wearing art clothes. This can get quite messy. The first thing we're going to do is set down a ground on our piece of paper. So I'm using the side of my compressed charcoal and I'm softly making marks vertically across the page, followed by horizontally across the page. And I want to get a nice even layer of charcoal down on my paper. Once I have that layer of charcoal down, I'm going to use my chamois and I'm going to use a circular motion with light to moderate pressure, and I'm just going to go ahead and blend that charcoal onto the paper. I'm trying to get rid of as many of the streaks as possible and just create a very even tone across the page. So now I'm ready to start drawing, and I'm going to start by looking at my reference image and use some of those sighting techniques. So I want to get a sense of what the ratio is of the height of the overall subject matter versus the width. And I'm using my pencil here to get a general idea, and it's showing me that it's about 1 unit high by 1.5 units wide. And that helps me get set up on my page so that I don't end up with a drawing that's way too big or way too small. So I'm using my pencil here. I'm seeing I'm making it about 1.5 units tall, and then I'm kind of taking that measurement and doing that, one and a half of that across. So kind of using some math, adjusting it as I go, just so I have a little bit of a starting point before I start drawing to know where the subject is going to go on the page. Once I've done that, I can look at my first object and again use sighting techniques. So here I'm using my pencil and I'm seeing about, how tall the cube is compared to the overall image, the overall subject matter. And I'm just starting to block in that first edge of my cube, figuring out where exactly it's going to go. So I'm using my pencil horizontally, vertically, just to figure out where that first edge is going to go, how far to the left and how high it might be. So once I have kind of a general idea of about how tall that's going to be, I'm using my charcoal pencil to start sketching in the shape of the cube. Make sure you are using your charcoal pencils and not your graphite pencils. You don't want to mix graphite pencil and charcoal in the same drawing. So make sure you're sticking with one or the other. Here you see I'm also using my pencil horizontally to get a sense of the angles on the sides of that cube to see what angles those are at. So I'm using my pencil to get a sense of those angles, and I'm using those soft sketchy lines to start blocking in the cube. I'm going to keep working on this cube, measuring, making comparative measurements, the right face of the cube to the left face of the cube, which is wider, figuring out all of my angles. And you'll see after I sketch it in, I'll have to go back and revise it, as it will look more like a rectangular prism than a square prism. But that's okay. That's part of the underdrawing, is that it gives you a chance to make those mistakes and make those restatements as you go until you get it correct. Any lines that I don't want to keep, I can just use my chamois to kind of blend those back in to that ground that I laid before. So the chamois comes in really handy when drawing to help you erase the lines that you do not want to keep. Remember to also use vertical lines to help you figure out where things are in relationship to one another. So you see on the drawing there, I made a little mark to see where the two corners line up, and I can see that they're a little bit closer together than I had them in my drawing. So that allows me to go in and adjust my drawing again, just creating a little bit better accuracy. As I start to draw the cylinder that goes behind the cube, I want to pay attention to where that cylinder comes out from behind the cube, where that line is, and make note of that in my drawing, and continue to use those comparative measurements to figure out the height of the cylinder as well, and the width of the cylinder. So I'm really paying attention to all of those spatial relationships as I begin to sketch in those lines and ellipses. And of course, as I see changes that need to be made, in this case that the cylinder needed to be a little bit wider, go ahead and make those restatements as needed, and you can use your chamois as needed to erase lines that you don't want to keep. Notice also that I'm drawing through the cube, so I am letting my lines go through the cube as if the cube were see-through. This just helps me kind of get everything lined up correctly, and of course I can get rid of those lines later once I have the underdrawing how I want it. So now I'm ready to start blocking in the sphere, which of course will be drawn as a circle. And in order to kind of get a sense of where that sphere is going to go, I'm actually just blocking in a square shape first to get a sense of the scale for that sphere. And once I get that blocked in, I'm going to use those loose gestural strokes to get that circle, redrawing the circle several times until I feel like I get it about as close as I can for the underdrawing. And I'm using my shoulder, not my wrist here, to draw that circle in. I also want to make sure I draw in the edge of the table so that the forms don't appear to be floating in space, but actually have a surface that they're resting on. So looking at that reference photo, I'm seeing where that line is, that table edge, and I'm sketching that in as well. So now looking at the still life as a whole, seeing what lines are working, what parts are not working, and just going in and cleaning things up, making sure angles are correct and that everything is how it should be, using my chamois as needed to get rid of the lines that I don't need. Now I'm going to take a look at the cast shadows that are in my reference image and start to sketch those in. So there is a cast shadow that's actually on the face of this cube. So I'm sketching in the basic shape of that shadow. And I'm also going to want to draw in the cast shadow that is on the table surface as well from both the sphere and the cube. There's also a distinctive line where the core shadow is on this cylinder, so I'm blocking in that as well. Just a couple more touch-ups to the drawing, and then we will be ready to get shading. So when starting to shade with my charcoal, I want to start in an area that's relatively dark, but I don't want to go super dark yet. That gives me some room to get darker as needed. If I get too dark at the very beginning, it can be hard to lighten an area. But if I start with a nice middle to dark value, that works well. And I can lay on the charcoal using the side of the compressed charcoal. And then I can use my fingers or my chamois to help blend that charcoal together. You'll notice that the chamois, if there's a lot of charcoal being put down, will actually start lightening or removing charcoal, whereas the fingers will more smooth it all out. So you have to kind of get used to the effect that you get with both your fingers and the chamois and work back and forth that way. So I'm just starting with the two faces here of the cube. I see that the bottom right is of course darker than the top, so I'm just blocking in those first two values. I also noticed that my background from on my reference photo is quite dark, so I'm going to go ahead and use the side of my compressed charcoal to start to darken that background so I get a better idea of what the contrast is on the forms that I'm shading with the background. That background value is going to influence the way our eye sees the values on the forms. So it's really helpful if I know ahead of time, if I know that that's going to be a dark value, that I start to block that in. Even if I don't go quite as dark as I'm going to go in the end, you can see I haven't taken it all the way out to the edge of the paper yet. That's okay, I'll come in and do that later. And I'm using the side of my charcoal, but I'm putting a little extra pressure right towards the tip to give myself a nice crisp line at the edge of the cube. So you can really experiment with using your charcoal on the edge, but putting that little extra pressure towards the tip to give you that sharp edge. So with charcoal, in addition to adding charcoal to your paper, you also want to work subtractively. You want to remove charcoal in order to lighten areas. So what I'm doing is I'm kneading my eraser, I'm getting it soft, and then I'm going to come in here on this face of the cube where the light is hitting it and there's a highlight, and I'm using my kneaded eraser to remove the charcoal from that area. And you'll see as I continue to work, I'll be going back and forth repeatedly between adding and subtracting the media from the paper in order to achieve the values that I want. And the goal here is that we create these contour lines, these lines that I've sketched in. We want to create those using only contrast of value. So even though it starts off as a line drawing where we see a line separating one face of the cube with another, eventually we're just going to see that as a change in value. So you don't want it to feel outlined anymore by the time you're done with it. And I can use both those subtractive techniques of using my eraser or my chamois to remove charcoal and additive techniques to get there. So right now what I'm doing, where I'm removing charcoal from the top and adding charcoal to that side, I'm really getting rid of that outline and I'm creating that contour instead by just changing the values from one face to another without there being a distinctive black outline or white outline. As I start working on that cylinder, all the same ideas apply. I'm using my charcoal, the side of my charcoal, to block in the shadows. I am using my fingers to blend as I go, and I'm just trying to establish that base, blocking in the background as well around the cylinder so that I have an idea of what the contrast is between the form itself and the background value. You'll notice as you look at your reference images that most forms are also going to be showing some reflected light. So that is where the form gets a little bit lighter on the shadow edge because the light source is reflecting off of a wall or a tabletop and bouncing back onto the form. So when I look at the reference photo for the cylinder, I can see that reflected light, and I'm going ahead and using my kneaded eraser to block in that reflected light. I'm going to continue on here by using my kneaded eraser to add the highlights to the top of the cylinder and also establish that edge, again trying to get rid of any outlining but instead using a shift in value to show those contour lines now. And as I use my kneaded eraser to show the highlights on the left side of the cylinder, I'm also erasing following those cross contour lines. Remember, we talked about those already. So as I both add charcoal and remove charcoal, whenever I can, I'm following the cross contour lines of the form, which is going to add even more dimension to my drawing. And what I notice here is that line, that distinct line of where the shadow begins, started to get a little bit lost in my drawing as I blended the highlights in with the shadow. So I'm just reestablishing that line. I'm using my kneaded eraser to go back in and make that a lot more specific. So the shapes that shadows make and the shapes that the various values make on your form are important, and you want to always be looking back at your subject matter to make sure that you're capturing those shapes accurately. Lastly, I'm working on adding the value and the highlights to the sphere. So again, starting with the more of the core shadow area, establishing that edge, getting rid of an outline, and instead using my charcoal to get a nice crisp edge and blending it in with the middle values of the sphere. And then eventually I'll come back in with my kneaded eraser to pull out the highlights. I definitely want to look at that reference image and make sure I pay attention to what the shape of those highlights and the shape of that shadow is, and make sure that I'm accurately depicting that on the sphere. So I'll continue to adjust the shading, both adding charcoal and removing, until I get that how I want it. I also want to make sure I go in and I put in those cast shadows, which I had already sketched out on the paper, and pay attention to how those cast shadows do change in value. They're going to be a little darker in some areas and lighter in other areas. So I can apply the charcoal, use my finger to blend, and then if needed, I can always go back with the chamois to lighten it, or with the eraser to lighten it, kind of going back and forth until I get the values how I want them to be. And as you work on one area, you really will see how it affects the values to the side of it on the other forms, and you'll continue to go back and forth and adjust your drawing areas where you've already worked. You'll keep going in and working until you get things exactly how you want it to be. If you have a very small area of shadow and you want to use your charcoal pencil to get in there, you can, or you can just use the very edge of your compressed charcoal as well. You want to make sure you go in and finish your background if you haven't done that yet as well, so that by the end you have a really resolved final drawing. You may notice I have a couple kind of funny areas on my drawing where I ended up with some dark spots. I accidentally had rested my chamois at one point on top of my damp cloth, and so then when I went to use my chamois, it stained the paper, and you can see me there trying to rub it out, and it's not coming out. So do be aware not to get your drawing wet in any ways. When you add water to the charcoal, it basically makes it into an ink, and it will stain your paper. You also want to make sure your hands are very clean when you're working, because if you have oils on your hand, that also can start to stain or discolor the paper in funny ways. So yeah, just finishing up that drawing. It's never a bad idea to look away from it for a little while, come back to it a couple hours later, see any areas that need to be touched up. And once you have your 3 forms in, your cast shadows, your tabletop, your background, and you make sure that you have removed any outlining, your drawing will be complete.